Okay, guys, I apologize for that tech problems, and so I'm going to just pick up where we left off in class and hopefully give you enough of good information that you can ask me any questions you may have when we see each other again. First thing to understand is we are trying to take a look at that metric of GDP. We are trying to link it into this production possibilities curve and find the connection. We are also analyzing your modern mainstream Keynesian influenced concept of where spending is extremely important and household spend, businesses spend, but also the government is involved too. So we've added the government and what the government directs in terms of tangible assets like goods and services and resources in exchange, and have analyzed where dollars are flowing in terms of government expenditures or taxes which are derived from both households and the businesses themselves. If you need any reference, please turn your book to page 330, where I believe that will show you the circular flow where government is involved. Before this class, hopefully you have some background in microeconomics, and I know I was asking Preston about that. And given the opportunity, Preston would explain to all of this. And he would have said, look, the supply and demand for any individual good or service is you'll have a downward sloping demand curve, an upward sloping supply curve, and there are reasons for that. Those are called the laws of demand and laws of supplies, and that was a purpose of you guys studying economics before you came into this class after winter break. There's an idea called equilibrium, and in equilibrium there's no shortages nor surpluses. In theory, at this market price, the exact quantity, both being produced and supplied to the markets and being demanded or purchased in the markets, is the same, ladies and gentlemen. This concept of efficiency. However, when we discuss macroeconomics, we're going to have to adjust how we view that idea. So let me introduce you to the first model of what is called aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We've already talked about this once in class. So what I need you to understand is this concept of where they intersect, how it relates to not a single price, but now we're talking about the overall price level, because we're talking about aggregate, which is production of all goods and services. We're also not looking at the quantity of a single good or service, but we're going back to what Ryan had discussed, which is this idea of the GDP. And we always want to look at real GDP, ladies and gentlemen, as it is a more accurate measurement of productivity and growth. We now have this concept of aggregate demand. Notice how it is drawn subtly differently. It is not drawn as a straight line. If you took microeconomics, you'll understand why this model sometimes uses a straight line. Not that you need to. It's just that there is a difference between a straight line, obviously geometrically, and not. And that, of course, addresses this issue of slope. And we're going to talk about the shape, for example, of an aggregate supply curve, why it is drawn this way by the macroeconomists. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So this is the supply of all goods and services, and this is the demand for all those goods and services. Now, we also have not equilibrium quantity, but we have Q sub F. Q sub F will represent what is called full employment. So if you go back to your production possibilities curve, remember, if I'm a point on that model on the curve, it is assumed we are at full employment, ladies and gentlemen. And you guys, having studied unemployment, recognize that full employment does not mean every single person is working. Rather, it means generally that there are your natural categories of unemployment, which are indicative of a healthy economy, which in your case would be that frictional unemployment and that structural unemployment. So beyond that particular unemployment, the economy is using all resources as best it can. So let's go a little further, and now let's just analyze these particular ideas themselves. So the first thing I would like to show you guys is there is something called the aggregate demand curve. According to microeconomics, An individual product demand curve was based on the income and substitution effect, ladies and gentlemen. So if you ignore this A and rather say, oh, it's just a demand curve, and I'll draw one in just to show you guys. So if I am talking just about this particular demand curve, it is downward sloping, ladies and gentlemen, and it was based on the idea of the income effect. And what does that mean? That means that when the price of a single good or service goes down, then my income, relatively speaking, is actually going up. I'm becoming relatively more wealthy because I can purchase more goods and services, ladies and gentlemen, because the price of those has gone down. At the same time, if the price of, let's say, a Pepsi is going up, well, now that makes Coca-Cola's more relatively inexpensive. And as a result, I begin to shift and purchase more Coca-Cola. That is known as the substitution effect. And I think what we need to understand is when it comes to the income effect and the substitution effect, that might work really good at a microeconomic level, but does not work as well at a macroeconomic level. And of course, you may be wondering, well, why is that? The reason is because we're not talking about a single good or service. We're talking about all goods and services in this idea of a general price level. So there's no substitution effect. Well, why not? Because if a price or a good or service of Pepsi is going down, well, then Coca-Cola generally is heading down in the same direction. There's no rationale for me to switch to purchase more or less of a good or service because prices themselves for all goods and services, the general price level, are moving the same direction. So no substitution effect. At the same time, ladies and gentlemen, a decline in the price level doesn't mean that my nominal income is not reacting to that also. Meaning what? Meaning if the price level goes down and my nominal income stays the same, well, then I guess my real income has gone up. But my income is also matching the general move of the price level. So as the general price level of goods and services go down, well, so does the general price level of the resources I provide. So I am not in any way, shape, or form becoming more wealthy. There's no income effect. So this does pop up on the AP exam, ladies and gentlemen. The reasons why there's a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. In summary, you cannot use the same reasons for a single demand curve studied in microeconomics. So macroeconomists have identified three. One is known as the real balances effect, and that is this: higher price levels. Well, what actually happens as a result? What it means at a higher price level, the purchasing power of assets that you and I hold that have fixed money values, well, they're now worth less at higher price levels. Meaning if I have a fixed asset value of $1,000 and something costs $2, well, if that's something that costs $2 now costs, let's say, $50, clearly my fixed asset does not have the same purchasing power. So what do people do? We consume less, ladies and gentlemen. One more time. At a higher price level, there is less consumption for goods and services, called real GDP. So as you can see in this higher price level, it is relatively low production of output. What explains that? That was the point of the real balances effect. There's also another explanation known as the interest rate effect, and that is this: higher price levels increase the demand for money. So if the general price level is $10, there's demand for $10, ladies and gentlemen. But if the general price level goes up to $15, now there's a demand for $5 more. So with a fixed supply of money, once again, assuming the money supply is fixed, an increase in the demand for money will happen because I need more money to purchase those goods and services. And of course, if there's an increase in the demand for money, that will drive up the price for money. And at higher interest rates, ladies and gentlemen, because the price level has gone up, there will be less purchasing of goods and services. From the business perspectives, if the cost of borrowing is higher, then once again, they are less likely to expand. There will be less consumption of real GDP. And at the flip, if we're down at a lower price level and interest rates themselves are going lower, that is called the interest rate effect. And then we need to talk about how you and I buy goods and services both domestically and abroad, and that is known as the foreign purchase effect. If the U.S. price level raises, and once again, I'm talking about it's going up, well, what will you and I do? Well, ladies and gentlemen, now the U.S. produced good is relatively more expensive than the foreign produced good, in which case we will shift our consumption, ladies and gentlemen, from domestic goods, see, look at that, to foreign goods known as imports. At the same time, from the foreign perspective, if the general price level of the American produced goods goes up, it now makes American exports more expensive, relatively speaking, in which case less people abroad will purchase American goods, which means American exports go down. So in both cases, imports are increasing, which means Americans are consuming less real GDP in America, and our exports are decreasing, which means also those in other countries are purchasing less output produced in America. So once again, the shape of the aggregate demand curve is explained by those three things, not the same, of course, as microeconomics. So ladies and gentlemen, well, what about this curve? This never showed up in microeconomics. Let's talk about how the entire aggregate demand curve will move. In microeconomics, we talked about how the demand curve moved. They were called the determinants of demand. And it goes without saying that you're not going to see the same explanations because I'm not talking about a single good and a single price. I am talking about the general price level on all these goods and services. And the first thing I would love for you guys to notice is that often you're going to see generally a dashed curve in there. What does that mean? That is the multiplier effect. So the idea is that if AD sub 0, increases due to some increase of, let's say, consumption, that the multiplier effect will then carry it all the way to AD sub 1. So one more time. This is that initial increase in consumption, and the idea of the multiplier says that AD sub 0 in theory will move to AD sub 1. So a change in the price level, ceteris paribus, changes the amount of aggregate spending and therefore changes the amount of real GDP demanded by the economy. What do I mean? I am talking, and this is a big deal in microeconomics, I am simply making the argument that if I have P sub 1 right here and P sub 2 right here, if the general price level goes down, I, as you can see, am moving along a fixed aggregate demand curve, ladies and gentlemen. In microeconomics, we discussed how the only determinant of quantity demanded was the price, and that just moves you along a stable demand curve. And that is different than the actual curves themselves moving. Those are known as aggregate demand shifters, ladies and gentlemen. So let's take a look at some of the aggregate demand shifters right now. Number one is consumer spending. It goes without saying. Generally speaking, the overall consumer wealth, whether they're financial or physical assets, And the change in value of those will then have some sort of impact upon overall spending. Also, consumer expectations. Obviously, we are in a time where consumers are really kind of looking at what they're bringing in terms of income, taking a look at prices, taking a look at jobs right now, and kind of deciding what they're going to do or what they're not going to do. And that is us recognizing real incomes and what we think is going to be happening. This concept of all this money being pumped into the economy, and whether we will consume more now or consume more later. Ladies and gentlemen, one more time. Expectations, the behavior of the consumers are going to shift aggregate demand. And then debt. I know in many cases, many households are living off debt right now. Many people have lost jobs. Many people have not been allowed to work. Obviously, in some level, the government may have stepped in and provide financial assistance. However, that obviously cannot go on continuously, ladies and gentlemen. So now it comes down to this idea of debt, ladies and gentlemen. And if households are beginning to say, well, we have to draw down our debt, we're going to consume less goods and services, and how that has an impact over all the markets of all goods and services. And then, as we move from one administration to another, we're going to talk about this idea of personal taxes. We know what happens if there's tax cuts. In theory, you have more disposable income. We know what happens if there's tax increases. In theory, you have less disposable income. But it's not just you directly affected. It's you being affected by everybody, ladies and gentlemen, at a macroeconomic level. And we have to address the fact that taxes are applied on businesses also. And remember, for those of you who believe in massive taxes on, let's say, businesses or not, is that businesses have money and they may or may not purchase resources, which are jobs in the market. So be aware, this is talking about the entire aggregate demand curve moving, meaning AD sub 0 may shift to AD sub 1, or AD sub 0 could shift to AD sub 2, and that is how it is drawn. An initial aggregate demand curve, labeled, and then a new aggregate demand curve, labeled, however you think it is appropriate to label. One determinant of moving an entire curve, of course, is that consumer spending. And if you remember what Ryan told me when he was telling me about GDP, he actually called this capital C. So capital C is one of those components, which of course then helps me understand investment spending. Or what Ryan told me is I sub G in the expenditures approach. So ladies and gentlemen, we talk about businesses and the argument that the I sub G is the most volatile of the four components of the expenditures approach. We have to agree that businesses themselves have to look at the expected rate of return versus the real interest rates, ladies and gentlemen. So what happens to interest rates? That's what businesses are looking at. If interest rates are rising, well, what sort of investment projects have a rate of return that can match that cost and or exceed it? What happens when the interest rates are going down, ladies and gentlemen? And of course, the real interest rates are absolutely connected to the supply of monies that are available out there. All of this will shift the aggregate demand. Same thing, the rate of return. Well, are businesses looking and feeling confident about the future? Can it help explain what they will do right now? They may be sitting on more cash because they're concerned about future consumption. I sub G. Thirdly, well, according to Ryan, this is capital G. It does not matter whether it was perhaps President Trump, I just have him up here because now it's President Biden, and it doesn't matter, except to the politicians perhaps, what it's spent on from our perspective, ladies and gentlemen. The idea, once again, military infrastructure, public education, Medicare, and on and on and on, of which you may have a different political opinion, is that G is a component of the expenditures approach. So will the government spend or not spend? Businesses are looking at that. Consumers are looking at that. But where does the money come from? Is it being taken from you via taxation? Are you giving it to the government via purchasing government bonds and securities? It all depends. And lastly, of course, according to, once again, my authority, Ryan, this is X of N. So, ladies and gentlemen, what is going on with consumption habits, both domestically and abroad? And that relates to importing and exporting. It also relates to the fact that people domestically and abroad are using specific currencies, and the value of those currencies themselves begin to dictate whether or not you will rather purchase an import from abroad, or rather someone abroad would prefer an import from the United States. And I remind you, GDP takes a look at exports as a positive thing and imports as a negative thing. All of those factors, ladies and gentlemen, are going to shift potentially the aggregate demand curve. And make sure this is always drawn correctly, which means have your horizontal axis, label it RGDP. Have your vertical axis, label it the price level, not Q, not P. Have your initial aggregate demand curve, label it however you want. I would always encourage you to label it in some way that makes numerical sense. And then if you are arguing that you have shifted the entire curve, that means you need to draw an arrow to the right or to the left. Draw a new aggregate demand curve, label it appropriately. But the shift of the entire curve can only be explained either by consumer spending, capital C, investment spending, I sub G, government spending, capital G, or net export spending, X sub N. Ladies and gentlemen, apologize for the tech problems we had at school today. Hopefully we'll be able to pick up where we left off tomorrow. Have yourselves a great day, and always take a look at Google Classroom to understand my expectations for what you do still hold.